The conference room clock struck 4 p.m. when Gregory Shaw leaned back in his leather chair. His tie loosened just enough to look casual, almost celebratory. Across the polished table, the HR manager slid a thin folder toward me as if it were just another form. Another day. My name, Julissa Pierce, was stamped across the front in black ink. "Julissa," Gregory said, voice clipped and final. "We're letting you go, effective immediately. It's unfortunate timing." I felt the words slam into me, heavy and unreal, like glass shattering in slow motion. For a moment, I couldn't even lift the folder. My hands, so steady in board meetings for decades, felt like they didn't belong to me. The HR manager kept her eyes down, refusing to meet mine, as if dignity could be erased with paperwork. There was no thank you for the 32 years I had poured into this company. No handshake, no nod of respect, only Gregory's thin smile, sharp as a blade, and eyes that radiated the kind of satisfaction a man has when he thinks he's won. Before we continue, take a slow walk around your room or step outside for just 1 minute. Movement clears the heaviness more than we realize. And now, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from, and tap the like button and subscribe if you've ever felt erased after giving your best. Before I could find words, Erin, the young analyst barely 5 years into her career, leaned against the doorway. She had been hovering, waiting, her lips curled into a grin that made the room even colder. "I guess tomorrow is my big day," she said. The words rang with a careless arrogance. Her youth flaunted against my exhaustion. The sting of humiliation was sudden and hot, rising into my face. They hadn't just removed me, they had already replaced me, and Erin wanted me to know it. I forced myself to breathe, to look down at the folder, to absorb the date typed neatly on the termination notice. My heart tightened. 1 day before my retirement package matured. 1 day before $6 million was secured. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't bad luck. It was strategy, deliberate, cruel, precise. They had calculated the timing down to the hour, cutting me off just before the finish line. My chest felt hollow, my throat tight, as if every sacrifice, every holiday missed, every night spent building their empire, was being erased in real time. I sat frozen in my chair, paralyzed by the realization this wasn't just dismissal, it was theft disguised as business. The glass doors closed behind me with a hiss, and for the first time in 32 years, I stepped out of Axton Holt Industries not as a director, but as someone discarded. The evening air carried the sharp bite of autumn, and each gust felt like it was cutting through the armor I had worn for decades. My reflection in the darkened windows startled me, shoulders stooped, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. A woman who had given everything and walked away with nothing. As I walked toward the street, memories pressed in, heavy and relentless. I saw myself on the night of my daughter's wedding rehearsal, standing in a sterile conference room instead of a church pew. The board had called an emergency meeting about a merger. They said the company's future depended on it. I had promised my daughter I would be there. But instead, I dialed in, voice echoing through speakerphones, while she walked down the aisle alone for practice. I told myself it was just one night, that she would understand. Then came the winters when sickness clung to my lungs like chains. Pneumonia left me gasping, but I still showed up at the office, propped up by antibiotics and caffeine. My doctor had begged me to stay home. Instead, I pressed my ID badge to the scanner and dragged myself to my desk because deadlines didn't wait. Every time. I told myself loyalty would be remembered, that someone, someday, would thank me. The sharpest memory was the promise I made to my husband before he passed, sitting by his hospital bed, his hand trembling in mine. He whispered, "When retirement comes, let it be the moment we gather the family again. You've sacrificed long enough." So, I nodded through tears, believing I was building toward that day. Now. 1 day before I could keep that promise, it was gone. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jerking me back to the present. A text from my daughter. "Mom, will you be free for dinner tomorrow?" I stopped on the sidewalk, staring at the screen until the letters blurred. My throat tightened, and I bit down hard on my lip. How could I tell her that the dinner she hoped for, the celebration we had all waited for, was being stolen by men in suits who thought loyalty was expendable? I couldn't type a single word. My thumb hovered, then retreated. Silence was all I could manage. As I stood frozen, another memory surfaced, uninvited but sharp. The voice of Harold Holt, the founder. During a company anniversary dinner long ago, the trust was built for those who kept faith, not just kept positions. At the time, it had sounded ceremonial, almost poetic. But tonight, on the edge of humiliation, those words carried weight. They felt like a reminder from the past that faithfulness was not worthless, and perhaps not forgotten. A flicker of something, small but undeniable, stirred beneath the bitterness. The apartment was quiet when I closed the door behind me. Too quiet for a woman who had spent 3 decades with her life tethered to ringing phones and late-night emails. I set my purse down, exhaled slowly, and walked to the far corner of the room where an old steel safe sat tucked beneath shelves of forgotten binders. Its surface was scratched, the handle stiff with age, but the numbers came back to me like muscle memory. My hand steadied as I turned the dial. The door creaked open, and inside lay relics of a life I had almost forgotten. Family photos, letters from my husband, and a thick envelope stamped with the Holt family crest. My breath caught. The founder's trust. I hadn't touched it in years, not since the old board dinners when Harold Holt himself would stand. Glass raised, and remind us that loyalty mattered more than ambition. I pulled the envelope out, its edges yellowed, and spread the papers across my kitchen table. My name stared back at me in elegant print. Julissa Pierce, trustee. Out of 3 original signatures, mine was the only one still alive. The other 2, Harold Holt and his brother Martin, were long gone. I had assumed the role was symbolic, a ceremonial nod to history, but now, reading with new eyes, it felt like something more. My phone buzzed. A message lit the screen from Daniel, a young attorney I had mentored years ago. "They forgot you're still on it. Don't move too quickly, but look at the fine print." For the first time since the humiliation in that conference room, my chest didn't feel quite so hollow. I turned back to the document, scanning line after line until a phrase stopped me cold. Continuity breach provision. My fingers tightened on the paper as I read. If a designated trustee is removed from position without proper cause, all assets tied to the founder's trust shall be immediately frozen. Oversight shall transfer to the remaining trustee. My pulse quickened. The words weren't ceremonial. They were binding. They meant that my dismissal, executed with arrogance and without process, had tripped a wire buried in the company's foundation. $2.4 billion worth of wire. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of it sink in. Calm spread through me. Not the numbness of defeat, but something steadier, almost like hope cautiously unfolding after a storm. The company thought I was powerless, stripped bare in front of them. Yet here, hidden in old paper and forgotten signatures, was a lever they hadn't accounted for the first time since walking out of those glass doors. I felt the ground shift ever so slightly beneath my feet, not in collapse, but in possibility. I never imagined an old envelope could carry that much power. Did this surprise you as much as it did me? What do you think will happen when Gregory realizes what I still hold in my hands? Stay with me until the end. You won't want to miss how this plays out. The city pulsed around me as twilight settled in. Neon lights flickering to life against the darkening sky. Crowds pressed forward on the sidewalks, laughter spilling from restaurants and bars. The sound of lives that were still moving forward. I walked among them, But I felt like a ghost, untethered, invisible, as though 32 years of loyalty had been erased, not just from the company, but from the world itself. I pulled my coat tighter around me and passed the glass tower that had once carried my nameplate at its entrance. Inside, I could see silhouettes moving briskly across the lobby. A few familiar faces spotted me through the glass, then quickly looked away. One man, someone I had promoted a decade earlier, lowered his eyes and ducked behind the reception desk, pretending to check his phone. Another woman, who had once leaned on me during a crisis, pivoted sharply and disappeared into an elevator. They weren't cruel, just afraid. To be seen acknowledging me might make them targets. Still, the avoidance cut deep. My footsteps carried me without direction until I found myself outside a bar a few blocks away. Music thumped inside, spilling out when the door opened. I hesitated, then glanced through the window. That's when I saw her. Erin, my replacement. She was perched at a high table, her drink lifted in a mock toast, laughter spilling from her lips. Colleagues crowded around, clapping her on the back. She thought she'd walk out with millions. Erin's voice rang out, loud enough to reach the street. She raised her glass higher, eyes glinting. Now she walks out with nothing. The words hit me harder than Gregory's smirk had hours earlier. Nothing. Was that what they all believed? That decades of sacrifice could be reduced to nothing with one signature? I turned away before Erin could catch sight of me, but the sting burned in my chest. I had become a punchline in the very world I had helped build. I wandered farther, letting the night swallow me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification flashing across the screen. At first, I thought it might be my daughter, but it wasn't. It was a forwarded message, anonymous, a screenshot of Gregory in a private chat. His words stark and cutting. "We cut her clean. Tomorrow the board will see my strength." My breath caught. The humiliation was not an accident, it was a performance. He wanted the board to see him as ruthless, decisive. My destruction was meant to be his proof of power. I stood frozen under the glow of a street lamp, my reflection warped in the puddle at my feet. Loneliness pressed in, sharp and suffocating, but beneath it flickered a fragile spark. If Gregory thought erasing me would showcase his strength, he had underestimated the quiet power of someone he had already written off as nothing. The morning light cut across my apartment floor like a blade, sharp and unkind. I hadn't slept all night. The smirk and laughter from the boardroom replayed in my head until they felt branded into my skin. When the phone rang just after dawn, I almost let it go to voicemail, but the caller ID flashing First National Bank jolted me upright. The voice on the line was tight, rushed, almost panicked. "Ms. Pierce, accounts tied to Axton Holt Industries have been restricted. Our systems show a freeze. $2.4 billion in assets, locked. Can you confirm if this is intentional?" My breath caught. I gripped the phone harder, hearing my own pulse in my ears. "No," I said softly. "Not intentional." When the call ended, I stood in the stillness, staring at my reflection in the black screen of the television. 2.4 billion. The number echoed, immense and unreal. The humiliation from yesterday still pulsed like a bruise. But under it, now something heavier pressed. Shock. I flicked on the TV. News anchors filled the screen with urgent voices. Markets rattled after reports that Axton Holt Industries has had assets totaling over $2.4 billion unexpectedly frozen. Trading halted as investors demand clarification. Neither CEO Gregory Shaw nor the company spokesperson has commented. Images rolled, journalists crowding headquarters, employees pacing hallways, stock tickers drowning in red. The empire I built piece by piece was coming undone, not because of me, but because of what had been set in motion when they thought they'd cut me out clean. My phone buzzed again. Daniel Hayes, a veteran investor, sounded raw. "Jalissa, what's happening? Gregory's saying it's a glitch, but we all know that's nonsense. I pressed the phone close. Part of me wanted to shout the truth. Another part knew silence was stronger. Daniel, I said evenly. Sometimes a glitch isn't in the system. Sometimes it's in leadership. A long pause. So it's true then, he murmured. He's finished. I ended the call, fingers trembling. Was I really at the center of this? Could a system forgotten for decades still hold teeth sharp enough to tear a company apart? Then my email pinged. High priority. I opened it. Continuity breach detected. Trustee authority, Julissa Pierce. The sun warmed my face as humiliation shifted to astonishment. And astonishment steadied into something else. Satisfaction. They tried to erase me. Instead, my name now sat across $2.4 billion. The news spread faster than any official memo ever could. By mid-morning, every outlet was running the same headline. Axton Holt assets frozen, leadership silent. Footage of anxious employees crowding the lobby looped across television screens. The ticker beneath announced plunging stock values in red. Each percentage drop another nail in Gregory Shaw's coffin. I sat in my apartment, coffee untouched on the table beside me, watching the spectacle unfold. After decades of being invisible, my absence now echoed louder than my presence ever had. The same executives who once avoided my calls were suddenly locked in a boardroom, their raised voices bleeding through leaked transcripts on social media. Contracts are suspended. Clients are demanding explanations. Payroll's frozen. Employees are panicking. This is a catastrophe. Who authorized this? Gregory's bark cut through the noise. Calm down. It's a temporary glitch. Legal will fix it. But panic has a smell, and the boardroom reeked of it. The irony was almost too sweet. The man who smirked as he stripped me of $6 million was now scrambling to explain why $2.4 billion had vanished into a legal freeze he couldn't control. I leaned back on my chair, letting the quiet satisfaction wash over me. Not triumph, not revenge, something colder, steadier. A reminder that arrogance carries its own punishment. By noon, the press had sharpened its knives. Analysts questioned whether Axton Holt had been hiding debt. Journalists speculated about structural fraud. Satellite trucks lined the street outside headquarters. Cameras pointed at glass doors that no executive dared open. Gregory, who loved the spotlight, was now barricaded behind it. My phone buzzed. A new message, short and precise, from an unknown number. Only you can unlock this. They will crawl back. I didn't need to guess who sent it. The initials at the bottom, RK Chief Financial Officer, told me everything. The CFO was reaching past Gregory, straight to me. My name, buried for years in ceremonial paperwork, now sat at the center of the company's survival. I let the message sit unread for a moment, savoring its weight. Once, these men had dismissed me as tradition, a relic of the old guard. Now they were whispering in the dark, desperate for the very signature they had tried to erase. The cameras showed Gregory leaving the boardroom briefly, jaw tight, tie crooked. A journalist shouted, "Is it true the company's assets are frozen under a former director's name?" He ignored the question, but the flinch in his eyes told me he knew. I sipped my coffee, finally cooled enough to taste. The bitterness suited the moment. They thought firing me would silence me. Instead, it was their voices cracking on live television, their empire staggering under its own weight. I didn't need to step inside that boardroom. My presence was already there, in their panic, in their silence, in the fact that every road forward now passed through me. The invitation came not as a courtesy, but as a summons. My phone lit up with the subject line, "Emergency Board Session. Attendance required." I read it twice, noting the irony. Yesterday, they had erased me with a smirk. Today, they couldn't move forward without me. By late afternoon, I walked once more through the glass doors of Axton Holt Industries. The same employees who had averted their eyes before now stared openly. Curiosity and unease etched into their faces. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, save for the low hum of machinery. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked steady, composed, almost detached. The humiliation had burned away. In its place sat something quieter, heavier, authority. The boardroom was suffocating with tension. Phones vibrated constantly on the table, news alerts flashing across screens. Directors shifted in their leather chairs, their faces pale from the market's collapse. Gregory Shaw stood at the head of the table, his tie loose, his voice pitched higher than usual as he tried to mask desperation with authority. "Julissa," he began, forcing a smile. "Thank you for coming. This is all just a misfire in the system. We need you to sign this release so we can restore order." A folder slid toward me, its contents clipped and waiting. I didn't touch it. I let the silence stretch, feeling the weight shift in the room. For the first time in decades, their gazes rested on me, not as background, not as tradition, but as the fulcrum on which their empire now balanced. As Gregory continued his rehearsed reassurances, a voice from my left cut through the noise. One of the senior directors, leaning close so only I could hear, whispered, "If you sign, he'll bury you again." I met his eyes briefly, offering no reply, but the warning settled in my chest. These men weren't blind. They knew Gregory's promises were nothing more than survival tactics. Gregory straightened, sensing hesitation. "Julissa," he said, his tone softening. "I'll make this right. Sign, and I'll personally reinstate your retirement. The full $6 million, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like bait on a hook, around the table. A few heads nodded, as if that sum could erase decades of sacrifice. But I saw what they couldn't. $6 million was never the prize. Power was, and Gregory was handing it to me without even realizing it. I folded my hands neatly on the table, the faintest of smiles tugging at the corner of my lips. His desperation only underscored my calm. I didn't raise my voice, didn't pound the table, didn't let anger rule me. Authority didn't need noise. Authority lived in silence, in stillness, in the knowledge that the other side needed you more than you needed them. "Interesting offer," I said evenly, "but let's see what tomorrow brings." The directors exchanged uneasy glances. Gregory's jaw tightened, his mask slipping. In that moment, I no longer felt like the woman discarded in a conference room. I felt like the axis on which the company turned. The folder lay open in front of me, its pages crisp, the signature line waiting like a trap disguised as salvation. Gregory slid a pen across the polished table with a trembling hand, his eyes fixed on mine. Around us, the room had gone silent, phones muted, breaths shallow, every gaze locked on the moment. I picked up the pen. My fingers moved slowly, deliberately, not from hesitation, but from intent. I wanted them all to feel the weight of every second, to taste the tension thickening in the air. Gregory's forehead glistened under the overhead lights. He thought he was watching me crumble, that the lure of $6 million would be enough to bend me. Behind me, I heard the faint rustle of movement. Aaron, my so-called replacement, leaned toward a colleague and whispered just loud enough, "She's weak, she'll sign." The words cut, but not in the way she expected. I didn't flinch. Instead, I let the insult settle like dust, insignificant against the granite of my resolve. Let them think I was fragile. Let them believe this was the end of my fight. Their certainty was my weapon. I lowered the tip of the pen to the page. Gregory exhaled, shoulders sagging with premature relief. A few directors leaned forward, ready to declare the crisis over. The room was a coiled spring, desperate for release. Then, without so much as a pause, I set the pen down, not across the signature line, on the table. My hand slid the folder gently back toward Gregory. I looked him straight in the eye and said, clearly and coldly, "No." The word cracked through the room like glass shattering. Gasps rose from the directors. Chairs creaked as bodies shifted in disbelief. Gregory's jaw fell slack, his face draining of color. The false hope he had nurtured collapsed in an instant. Erin muttered something under her breath, her confidence shriveling in the sudden silence. Even the board members who had doubted me now stared with something new in their eyes. Not pity, not fear, but respect edged with awe. Gregory tried to recover, stammering, You don't understand what's at stake here." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted, my tone measured, unshaken. "And that's why I won't sign. You took 32 years of loyalty and thought you could erase it with a smirk. But this—" I tapped the folder with one finger, slow and deliberate. "This doesn't belong to you anymore." The weight of the silence that followed was mine to command. I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady, untouchable, for the first time. They all understood. Control didn't lie in ink on a page. It lay in the refusal to surrender. And I wasn't surrendering. Not now. Not ever. The boardroom was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air vents. The folder still sat untouched in front of Gregory, my refusal hanging in the air like smoke. I let the silence stretch before I finally reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope that had never left my side since I rediscovered it. The crest of the Holt family gleamed faintly under the lights. "This isn't just about a freeze," I said evenly, spreading the documents across the table. "The founder's trust was designed with teeth. It doesn't simply lock assets in retaliation, it transfers authority. $2.4 billion no longer belongs to this table. It belongs to me." Gasps rippled around the room. Gregory's eyes bulged, his face a storm of disbelief and fury. "Fraud!" he roared, slamming his hand on the table so hard the water glasses trembled. "This is fabrication. She's making it up." But the senior corporate counsel, a man who had remained silent through most of the meeting, leaned forward and adjusted his glasses. His voice was calm, almost surgical. "Mr. Shaw, with respect, that's not true. I reviewed these documents years ago. You yourself re-signed the supplemental agreement when the company restructured in 2018. Your signature ratified every clause she's citing." The blood drained from Gregory's face. He opened his mouth, but no sound came. The room shifted. The directors who had once hung on his every word were now leaning away from him. Their attention locked on me. I kept my tone steady, cold, controlled. "I didn't ask for this. I never wanted a war. But when you tried to strip me of my pension, you triggered something you didn't even know existed. You didn't just humiliate me. You handed me the company's future." The CFO, seated at the far end, cleared his throat and spoke up for the first time. "She's right. Without her authorization, payroll won't resume, contracts won't clear, the investors won't wait much longer. If she doesn't sign, we're finished." Another director leaned forward, his voice quieter but firm. "Gregory, you led us into this crisis. Julissa is the only one who can get us out." The words landed with the weight of betrayal. Gregory's empire was crumbling in front of him, not by my hand alone, but by the realization that he had built his throne on arrogance and ignorance. I gathered the papers calmly, sliding them back into the envelope. My gaze swept across the table, meeting each pair of eyes. "I am not your scapegoat. I am not your relic. I am the trustee, and from this moment on, you will deal with me." The silence that followed wasn't resistance, it was acceptance. For the first time, the boardroom no longer belonged to Gregory Shaw. It belonged to me. The door to the boardroom closed behind me with a heavy click, muffling the chaos I left inside. Behind that glass, Gregory Shaw was unraveling before his own directors, his empire collapsing not with fire or noise, but with silence and signatures he never understood. I walked down the corridor, my heels striking the marble floor with steady rhythm. For the first time in years, each step felt light, By the time I reached the lobby, the outside world had already caught wind of what had happened. A wall of cameras flashed from the street. Headlines scrolled across the ticker screens above the elevators. Assets frozen by former director. Reporters shouted questions through the revolving doors, but their words blurred into background noise. Let them speculate. The truth would unfold soon enough, and this time it would be on my terms. As I turned toward the exit, I caught sight of a cluster of employees huddled near the security desk. Their faces were drawn with worry. One young woman wiping tears from her cheeks. "Payroll is suspended," she whispered to a colleague, her voice breaking. "How am I supposed to pay rent?" I stopped. For decades, I had carried this company on my back, believing my loyalty would protect the people who worked beside me. Gregory had treated them as pawns, numbers on a ledger, but they were more than that. They were the reason Axton Holt had survived crises that would have drowned lesser firms. I walked over, lowering my voice so the cameras outside couldn't hear. "Ma, I know you're afraid," I said gently, "but I give you my word. The payroll fund will be the first account I release, not tomorrow, not next week, soon. You'll get what you've earned." The young woman blinked at me, stunned, before nodding quickly, for a moment. The despair in her eyes eased. That, more than headlines or billions, reminded me why this fight mattered. I stepped into the cool evening air. The city alive with chatter. Phones buzzed on every corner with the same alert. Axton Holt crippled by internal collapse. Gregory's name was being dragged through the mud, while mine, erased just a day before, was back at the center of the story. Then my phone vibrated again. A message lit the screen. "Mom, dinner tonight?" I stopped on the sidewalk, my throat tightening. For years, I had missed dinners, recitals, milestones, telling myself it was for the future. Now, standing in the wreckage of a company that had tried to discard me, I had finally reclaimed something far more precious. I typed one word back. Steady and certain. Yes. Sometimes liberation doesn't roar. It arrives quietly, in the power to say yes to what truly matters. Jalissa's story is proof that even when betrayal tries to erase us, dignity and justice can still be reclaimed. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated or cast aside only to find your strength again? Share your story in the comments. Tap like if this resonated. And subscribe for more stories of resilience and unexpected triumphs.